Our lesson objective is I can graph cosecant and secant functions. So we've been working with the graphs of sine and cosine. So we're going to figure out what happens when we plot the reciprocal of each value. So we're going to use the sine curve graph below to fill out the table for y equals cosecant of theta. Cosecant of theta is the same as 1 over sine of theta. So we're going to fill out this table. So if we want what is theta what is cosecant of theta when theta equals 0? So we see over here that this point here is 0, 0, and in other words, this says sine of theta equals 0. So 1 over sine of 0 is 1 over 0. And because of that, this is going to be undefined, because 1 over 0 is just undefined. So then we go over now to pi over 6. Now, sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. So 1 over sine of pi over 6 is going to be 2. And it looks like this, like the whole thing equals 2, not just the denominator. So then this will be 2. So then we're going to do pi over 2, so that's this value here. So if you see here, sine of theta is 1. 1 over 1 is just 1. For 5 pi over 6, consider this reference angle here. It's going to be right here. So this reference angle is pi over 6. So sine of pi over 6 is going to be 1/2, so this will also be 2. And then sine of pi is just 0, so this is 1 over 0, which is just going to be undefined. So now what we're going to do is actually draw using these values. We're going to draw cosecant using these values, the graph of cosecant. So where we have our undefined values, 0 and pi, we're going to have vertical asymptotes. And then what we're going to have is we're going to have a value here at 2. We're also going to have a value here of 1, and we're going to have another value here of 2. And this graph will look like this. And pretty much this is the whole idea of how you do these graphs. So I'm not going to actually even use that same method to actually graph over here. I'm just going to go ahead and add the vertical asymptote, and then the graph will look like this. So you really just draw a vertical asymptote, and then you draw these parabolas, kind of. I shouldn't say that, but that's really the idea of it. So then we can go through and now figure out our other values. So cosecant of 7 pi over 6. Now 7 pi over 6 will be in this quadrant. So this is pi over 6 again. So this is going to be 1/2 for sine, so it's going to be 2. But this time it's now below the x-axis, so it's -2. And for the same reason, we're going to have -2 for 11 pi over 6. We go ahead and graph 11 pi over 6. It's going to be somewhere over here. And then our reference angle is pi over 6. I'm really emphasizing here that we're just using reference angles here. So then 3 pi over 2, that's going to be, this here is the 3 pi over 2 value. That's where the angle lives. So that's going to be -1. So -1, and then 2 pi is going to be 360 degrees. That's going to be undefined. So these values here correspond to this part. And then these values correspond to this part. For what values of theta will the graph of cosecant of theta have vertical asymptotes? Are you able to list them all? Why or why not? So cosecant of theta will have vertical asymptotes when cosine of theta is 0. I'm sorry, sine of theta is 0. Some of the examples are 0, pi, 2 pi, and we cannot list all of them because it's when sine of theta is 0 and we know the sine curve goes on forever. So now it says, at what values is cosecant of theta equal to sine of theta? So when theta is pi over 2 or 3 pi over 2, in other words, when sine of theta is 1 or negative 1. So now it says sketch the cosecant curve on the axis. We already did that. And then it says, what is the range of the graph y equals cosecant? So that's going to be from negative infinity to negative 1, including 1, union 1 to infinity. And the idea is if we had this graph of sine, this graph only goes either to 1 or negative 1, and then this other graph at the most goes to 1 or negative 1. That's the idea of this problem. I'm going to erase this though because this isn't the best drawing. Now suppose we have to graph y equals secant of theta, which is 1 over cosine theta. And it says name the 3 vertical asymptotes between 0 and 3 pi. So that is on this graph here, because this last point here is 3 pi. So it's when cosine of theta is going to equal 0. So that's pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 3 pi. Now it says use the cosine graph below to sketch the secant curve. So I'm going to first draw my vertical asymptotes, and then we just go ahead and draw our curves. Now it says, what is the period of y equals cosecant theta and y equals secant theta? So they're the same as cosine and sine, which are 2 pi. Here we have f of x is 3 halves times cosecant of x. So we're going to graph f of x equals 3 halves sine of x. Now we go ahead and draw vertical asymptotes wherever sine of x is 0. And now we just draw our little parabolas, I like to call them. And that's the graph. So here we're going to graph f of x equals 2 times secant of 4x. So what I'm going to do is actually graph 2 cosine of 4x. So that was in the last video. So I'm going to just go ahead and write it down. You should refer to the last video if you need help with this still. All right, that's the sine graph. Now we're going to go ahead and draw our vertical asymptotes when cosine is 0, sorry. There's quite a few for this one, but that's okay. So then we just go ahead and draw the upside down parabolas. Not the upside down parabolas, just parabolas as I like to call them. So I've literally just been drawing these. So really, once you have cosine graphed, it's really not that challenging. You just draw the vertical asymptotes and then you draw these. I'd say these graphs could be very, very inaccurate. You know, no one's going to check the points that closely ever. So don't feel too afraid about messing it up. As long as you do the first graph right, you really won't mess this one up. Here we have negative secant of 4/3 x. So we're going to go ahead and graph negative cosine of 4/3 x. Okay, so now we go ahead and we draw our vertical asymptotes. Actually, really need the stencil for this one. We go ahead and draw our graphs. Here we have f of x is 5 halves cosecant of 2x. So I'm first going to graph f of x is 5 halves sine of 2x. All right, now I have my sine graph, so I'm going to go ahead and add my vertical asymptotes again. Okay, so we have our vertical asymptotes, and then we can go ahead and draw the rest of our graph. Here we have f of x is cosecant of x minus pi over 4 minus 2. So we're going to graph sine of x minus pi over 4 minus 2. So we have our vertical asymptotes at our midline here. Then we just go ahead and draw our curves. After this lesson, you can graph cosecant and secant functions.